It was used to stave off worldwide hunger at the beginning of the 20th century and was later used for the Next, Thomas Hager recounts the invention of synthetic fertilizer by scientists Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch. It was used to stave off worldwide hunger at the beginning of the 20th century and was later used for the development of munitions during World War II. The program, hosted by Olson's Books and Records in Washington, D.C., is 45 minutes.
Thank you. Nice to be here on a really beautiful evening in Washington, D.C., and talk a little bit about the history of our society and how we came to be where we are in our society, and talk a little bit about some surprising things that most people don't know about our history and our culture. I was walking around today here in Washington, D.C., as I have in many cities. I traveled part of the world researching this book. I got to go to South America and visit several countries in South America and Europe. And I've been in Asia studying and doing research. And everywhere I go in major cities, even in South America, I am struck by the plenitude that I see even in cities in Peru, which is not a highly developed country, even in cities in Mexico and in Asia, you walk around and you see that this is an age of plenty. We live in an age of plenty. There's never been an age like it, really. Today, we are not afraid of something that people all throughout human history have been afraid of. You know, throughout human history, people have worried about famine. Famine was one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Famine was a constant in human development all the way from the beginnings, hundreds, thousands of years ago, until just about 100 years ago. Famine was a part of life. Huge famines swept across the earth depending on how crops came in and depending on the size of the populations involved, and carried away millions of people. I grew up in the 60s, and I was a sort of a budding ecologist in high school. I read a book called The Population Bomb. Population Bomb was a very popular book in the 60s, and it was a description of the dangers of overpopulation. And overpopulation is easy to understand. In fact, overpopulation has been talked about in statistical terms ever since the Reverend Malthus back in England in the 18th century talked about his Malthusian ideas about the simple ratio, sort of simple comparison between how population grows and how food is produced. Population grows geometrically. Two parents have 4 kids, and they have 8 kids, and they have 16 kids, and so on. And so every generation you add a lot more people, and populations mushroom that way. Food production, on the other hand, increases slowly. Food production increases little by little, sort of acre by acre, and it can't keep up. Inevitably, a rising population, fast rising population, will overtake its food supply, and people will start starving. It's true in the natural world with natural populations of animals, and it's true of humans too. Well, the population bomb written in the 60s described what was going to happen in the 70s. And the prediction was mass starvation. Mass starvation was going to happen starting in India. I seem to remember from my high school days the prediction being that around the mid-70s, early 80s, there was going to be millions of people starving to death in India. And I expected that to happen. Seemed logical to me. And it never happened. Instead, what we're seeing, instead of mass starvation, what we're seeing is an incredibly fast-rising population. Population, I'm 55 years old. Population of the world has doubled since I was born. Incredibly fast-rising population. And yet, there is no mass starvation. There's no mass starvation anywhere. The last really large-scale mass starvation on Earth was in China in the 1960s, and that was political famine, caused in great part by Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward policies, caused famine in China at that time. That was the last great famine we've seen on Earth. And instead, what we have is an epidemic of obesity. What we're finding is now in the United States, where 2/3 of the people in the United States are considered to be overweight or obese, and you find that even in Mexico, half the population is now overweight or obese. 20% of the school children in China are overweight or obese. Obesity-related diabetes is a growing problem in India instead of mass starvation. And so it leads to this paradox to me. And part of the reason that I researched and wrote this book is I'm wondering what happened. What happened to those logical predictions? Why didn't the population outstrip the food supply? Why aren't we all starving? And instead of starving, why are we all eating better than ever before? You know, if you look at the statistics, there's 6.7 billion people on Earth, and on average, per person per day, people on Earth are eating more calories than they ever have in human history. I'm not saying anything about the quality of the food we're eating. We could talk about that all night. But just in terms of sheer calories, we have this huge population, and everybody's eating better than ever. It's just paradoxical. So I wanted to find out how that happened. And what I did was, as I went down that path, I found out that our era of plenty, this food that we're enjoying, is the result of, in great part, a single invention that nobody's ever heard of, that was made by two men who had dramatically important and tragic lives. And those are two men that no one's ever heard of. And in fact, the invention not only made possible this era of plenty that we're in, it actually made World War II possible. And it's responsible for one of the most important ecological problems that we're going to be facing in the next 20 or 30 years. So that was the story I got to tell in this book. Tremendous benefit, tremendous honor, really, for a science historian like me to run across a story like this. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the two guys who made this invention, what the invention is, and how it has really altered our society and societies around the world. We're going to meet a couple of people, most of whom you've never heard of, but Adolf Hitler as well plays a role in this book. And this invention played a mighty, mighty role in the history of Germany and Germany's role in the world. So to start with, I want to set the stage by talking a little bit. Actually, I'll do a reading from the book. I'm going to talk about what the world looked like in 1898. In 1898, just as the 20th century was about to dawn, a prophecy was made. The prophecy was made in the fall of 1898 in a music hall in Bristol, England, by a thin man with a graying, neatly trimmed beard and a mustache waxed to alarmingly long, needle-like points. A really fabulous mustache, if you've ever seen. I'll tell you who this is, but man, he had mustache out there. His audience, the cream of British science, thousands of formally dressed men and bejeweled women, were seated in a low-rent venue, what Americans would have called a vaudeville palace, a last-minute substitute for an academic auditorium that had burned down. But they dutifully filed in and filled every seat from the orchestra pit to the upper seats. Exquisitely gowned women began opening their fans. Evening-coated men began murmuring to their neighbors that it looked as if it was going to be a long evening. The speaker was Sir William Crookes, 1898's incoming president of the British Academy of Sciences. Impeccably dressed, erect and resolute, he looked every inch the triumphant, newly knighted physicist that he was. Inventor of the Crookes tube, a sort of predecessor of today's cathode ray tubes used later for televisions and computers. A recent discoverer of an interesting new addition to the periodic table that he had named thallium. Fearless explorer of science, even out to its farthest edges. Crookes was an active researcher in the area of seances and the question of life after death. Inaugural speeches were often deadly dull. The incoming presidents of scientific associations almost always droned long lists of achievements made during the past year, with nods to numerous individual researchers, sprinkled with homilies about the importance of science for the British Empire. Crookes, however, decided to shake things up. He adjusted his oval glasses, glanced at his notes, looked up, and got right to the point. England and all civilized nations, he said, stand in deadly peril. The fans in the balcony stopped fluttering. Crook's voice was clear, but he spoke softly. The hall went silent, the audience straining to hear as the speaker continued. If nothing was done soon, he explained, great numbers of people, especially in the world's most advanced nations, were going to begin starving to death. This was a conclusion that he was forced to accept, he said, after considering two simple facts. As mouths multiply, he said, food sources dwindle. The number of mouths had been increasing for some time, thanks to advances in sanitation and medical care, from the installation of improved water systems to the introduction of antiseptics. Those were great triumphs for humanity, but they carried with them a threat. While population increased, land was limited. There were only so many farmable acres on Earth. When every one of those acres was under the plow and farmed as well as it could be, the population would keep going up. The farmed and refarmed soil would slowly lose its fertility, and mass starvation would of necessity ensue. His research led him to estimate, he said, that humans would begin dying of hunger in large numbers sometime around the 1930s. There was only one way to stop it, he said, and then he told them what it was. Well, that was the prediction in 1898. So we keep getting these predictions every 100 years or so. Calamity is coming. We're all going to starve to death. 1898, it was actually an accurate prediction. If nothing was done, humans would have started starving in huge numbers around 1930s, 1940s, depending on the numbers that you use. Crookes was pretty much right about his prediction. What he did in that address, which was reprinted around the world, it was a sensation. It was a huge sensation. It was sort of like Al Gore and An Inconvenient Truth Now. His prediction of coming catastrophe was heard everywhere that newspapers were printed and came out as a book later, sort of a bestseller book, and caused a lot of concern. He said that the only answer to the dilemma, the only way that humans were going to avert this disaster was if scientists figured out an answer. And he told them where the answer was. He said it was in the air. The air around us. You know, we're made out of air. Our bodies are made out of air. If you track back the atoms in your body, the top four, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, CHON, those four atoms make up about 90% of your weight. And all of those atoms come from the air. Carbon is pulled out of the air by plants, and they turn it into sugars and plant materials. And hydrogen and oxygen come in, some of it through plants, some of it in the water that we drink. Oxygen, of course, we breathe in and breathe out, and that's incorporated into our bodies as well. All of those are in the atmosphere, and they all end up making us. But it was the fourth element that Crookes was talking about, nitrogen, N, nitrogen. Nitrogen is the fourth most common element in your body, and in many ways, the most important. If you don't get nitrogen, you die. Nitrogen is what they call a limiting factor on life on Earth. And one way to understand that is by looking at your garden at home. If you've got a garden at home, especially a vegetable garden or flower garden, every year or so you fertilize it, right? You go out and you either do the organic sort of make compost, buy some manure, put it on there, or you go out and buy a bag of white granular stuff at the store. That's fertilizer, or grayish granular stuff, and you toss that on your plants and they grow better. That's the number one element that's in that bag of fertilizer or your compost or manure. Number one thing your plants are getting is nitrogen, because there's a very limited supply of nitrogen on Earth that's available to living things. It's called fixed nitrogen. It has to be in a certain chemical form. It's called fixed nitrogen. There's hardly any of it around compared to the hunger for it in all living things. However, if you got a lot of fertilizer, you can grow a lot of crops. You can grow a lot of flowers. The more nitrogen you put on plants, the more plants you grow, basically. That's true sort of in general. It's not true of all plants, but it's true in general. The less nitrogen you have, the less plant growth you have. Nitrogen is called a limiting factor in life. The only way to avoid starvation, Crookes said, was to figure out how to get nitrogen from somewhere else. There isn't enough in the soil. You know, you farm your soil, you use up the nitrogen. Plants use it up. They take it out of the soil. You have to put back more. That's fertilizing. Well, through centuries and centuries of experimentation, people figured out other ways. You can plant legumes, peas and beans, and there are certain plants that take nitrogen out of the air and put it into the soil, and that's very important. That's called crop rotation. So every 2 or 3 years you plant one of these crops, peas and beans, and you can get nitrogen back in the soil. But it's difficult to do, and it happens very slowly. It's bacteria that do that job for us. But that was the limit. If you couldn't get more nitrogen somewhere, you were done. You couldn't grow any more on an acre, and pretty soon your acres get played out, no matter how careful you are. So what Crookes said was the place to look was in the air around us, because the air around us is full of nitrogen. 80% of the atmosphere is nitrogen. What you're breathing in and breathing out right now, 4/5 of it is nitrogen. And it goes out and it comes in and it goes out. You breathe it in and out all day long. It doesn't do anything. You can't metabolize it. Your body can't use it. Atmospheric nitrogen is in a form that no living thing can use. No plant can use it. No animal can use it. The only thing that can use it are these few bacteria that grow on peas and beans and legumes and a few other plants. So we're in this ocean of nitrogen, and yet we're starving for nitrogen. It's like sailors being out on the ocean. You're surrounded by water, but you can't get a drink of water anywhere. We're surrounded by fertilizer, essentially. It's in the air, but you can't use it because of the chemical form it's in. When it's up in the air, nitrogen, it consists of 2 atoms of nitrogen that are really tightly bound together. N2, it's called, dinitrogen. They have 3 bonds, triple bond, that holds them together. It's one of the strongest bonds in nature. The only thing that can break that bond and release those nitrogens to go into living things is either those few bacteria that do it, that are in the peas and beans, and there's a wonderful story to be told there. The only other way to break that apart is a bolt of lightning. It takes that much power. Farmers used to have a old farmer's tale that if there was a big rainstorm with lightning, that your crops would grow better, and it's true. It's true. Lightning strikes, when lightning rips through the air, it breaks apart, it rips apart some nitrogen. And that nitrogen reforms with oxygen or whatever else is around. It'll form molecules that we can use. So if you're ever in a lightning storm, you can think, well, gee, and after a couple days, you're going to get a nice shower of fertilizer that comes down. That's true. Unfortunately, there's not enough lightning to make much difference on Earth in terms of nitrogen. Another way had to be found to do it. Crookes said, it's up to the scientists. Scientists attack this ocean of air, find a way to pull nitrogen out of that air, put it in our food, or we're going to start starving. And he was correct. So scientists around the world started this race to see who'd be the first to do it, solve the problem. And there were some funny people in the race. At that time, nitrogen, fixed nitrogen, this biologically useful nitrogen, was kind of like oil is today. There wasn't a lot of it around. It was very valuable, and it's something everybody around the world needed. The crisis for finding a way to create pull nitrogen out of the air was very much like our attempts right now to find energy sources, to find alternatives to oil or new sources of oil. It was that kind of global thing that was going on at the time, and some of the world's best scientists got involved in the race because they also knew that it was big money. Whoever could find a way to do that, whoever could find a technology that could take air and turn it, well, what they called it was making air into bread. You take air and you burn the nitrogen, or get the nitrogen out of the air, break it apart, fix it in a fertilizer, then you can grow crops, you can grow bread, you can grow wheat, corn, rice, you can make bread. So turning air into bread became this global race. There were a couple of guys, young guys, one of Thomas Edison's assistants, formed a little company, and he tried to start a way to do it. He had a machine that he built near Niagara Falls, and this is around 1902. And Niagara Falls was the only way that people knew to make a lot of electricity. There was so much water going over Niagara Falls, you could put a turbine on it and make a lot of electricity. This guy, this little company that he formed, they built a shack on the edge of Niagara Falls, ran high voltage electricity into it, and he tried to invent a machine that would create high voltage sparks that would flash around this revolving cylinder, and it would burn nitrogen out of the air. Well, they failed. They went bankrupt. There was a fellow in Scandinavia named Birkeland. Birkeland was sort of a mad scientist. He used to wear Arabian slippers on his feet with the little ends that curled up, and his big research interest was finding out what caused the northern lights. He wanted to know how the northern lights were caused. So he built a box in which he could artificially make the northern lights happen. It was Birkeland. Birkeland was going to solve it, and he actually came up with a machine that looked like it was going to work. It created this disc of flame that was about 6 feet around, a high-intensity flame made with electricity. He spread this flame out into a disc, and then they blew air through this disc of flame, and they burned nitrogen out of the air that way. It's just like a lightning bolt. It was the same idea as a lightning bolt, only they did it with this disc. And that idea actually was built into a factory and could make fertilizer for a while. But it was extremely expensive. It wasn't a good solution. So along came some really big players. And the big player that got into it from an economic standpoint was a German chemical company called BASF, still around. BASF is a very successful chemical firm. It was the #1 chemical firm in the world around the turn of the century, and they knew that if they could find a way to get nitrogen out of the air, they'd be the richest chemical firm on earth. So they assigned some of their best men to the problem, and they came up with nothing. After years of research, instead of them coming up with something, a professor in a nearby university built a little machine on his tabletop that was about, I don't know, maybe 3 feet long, a foot or two wide, and a couple of feet high. And this little machine, after years of tinkering, he found he could use a totally different method, and he could pull nitrogen out of the air. It was an extremely complicated method. It had to be at extraordinarily high pressures. So high, they had to force the gases together to make this happen. They had to be so high that no containers could hold them. They had to be so hot that iron would turn red hot at the temperatures they needed. But somehow he made it work. He could crank up this machine, and he could pull nitrogen out of the air and make it into a form of fertilizer called ammonia. Ammonia is a very valuable chemical stock. It's fixed nitrogen. You can make it into fertilizer. You can also make it into gunpowder. You can make it into TNT. You can make it into a lot of stuff. It's very valuable. Well, this guy figured out a way to have this little machine do this continuously. Air flowing in one end, high pressure, high temperature, a catalyst that he invented, and out the other end came fixed nitrogen. He took that to BASF and said, basically, I want a fortune, and you can have my idea. And BASF bought it. Put their the chemist's name was Hager, Fritz Haber, the guy who invented the machine. He became a rich man immediately. He was a very wealthy man at that point. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about Haber in a moment. He was also a German Jew, a very patriotic German Jew. This is around the time of World War I, just before World War I. At BASF, they assigned a young hotshot named Bosch to the question of how to take this little tabletop machine and at these, high pressures that nobody thought could be held in a container. In fact, they had to use quartz crystals that were drilled out to hold the pressure. And high temperatures, they asked this hotshot young fellow to find a way to ramp that up to a factory the size of a small city so that they could make fixed nitrogen by the ton. And Bosch figured out a way to do it. The extraordinary feat of chemical engineering. And within 3 years of getting the problem, they built their first factory, an enormously complicated machine that was as big as the square block that this bookstore is on. Bits and pieces, compressors and condensers and purifiers linked together in ways that had never been seen before, working at pressures that had never been achieved before. But he made this giant machine work. And BASF thought it was on its way to controlling the world market for fertilizer. And then World War I hit. Right at that time, World War I was declared, and Germany went to war, and the fertilizer plant that had been built was immediately turned to the production of gunpowder. So Bosch and Haber had worked in their minds, well, they were actually working for money, but they wanted to feed the world. their invention was taken almost immediately and turned to destructive purposes. The process for turning air into ammonia and into gunpowder was so successful that Germany stayed in the war for 2 years longer than they could have without it. And after the war, Bosch and Haber started to get back to work. And they thought about what else they could make using the same sort of process. High pressure chemistry. What else could they make using high pressure chemistry? What else could they make that would help the world and make a huge profit for BASF? And the answer they came up with was synthetic gasoline. They thought there was going to be an oil crisis in the 1920s. They thought the world was going to run out of oil. Standard Oil thought that they were tapping the last of the world's reserves around 1925. And so there was going to be a huge market for anybody who could make, because cars were getting to be popular, anybody who could make gasoline was going to make a fortune. Bosch, this genius at BASF, figured out how to turn his ammonia technology into synthetic gasoline technology. They put coal, which Germany had a lot of coal, put coal in one end, grind it up, fix it the right way, heat it to high temperatures, put it under pressure with a catalyst, and out the other end came very pure gasoline. Very pure gasoline, some very high quality gasoline. And it was expensive to do, but Germany didn't have oil holdings of its own. It needed a way to make this, and everybody thought the world was going to run out of oil, and they would have a corner on the market. So they got this perfected. In 1929, they made a deal with Standard Oil in the United States to back this research, and Standard Oil and the German firm, which was now called IG Farben, in the late 1920s. Some of you may have heard of IG Farben. It's a notorious Nazi chemical firm. Standard Oil and IG Farben got into a contract together to corner the market on synthetic oil around the world, and it looked like they were all going to get rich. And then a wildcatter in Oklahoma struck an oil well, a gusher in Oklahoma, that turned out to be the tip of a lake of oil that went underneath 5 states, in Texas and Oklahoma and all the way over into Louisiana. It was the biggest oil strike in history, and suddenly there was no oil crisis anymore. Of course, after that, we found more oil in the Middle East and everywhere else. And this synthetic oil technology never got used to a great extent, because there was plenty of natural oil, and that was cheaper and easier to get than making synthetic oil. And that was the situation in the early 1930s. Bosch didn't want to give up on it. He still thought that they could build huge plants and make synthetic gas. So he took his project. He needed money to make it work. He took his project to the German government, which was then controlled by Adolf Hitler. And he and his company, IG Farben, made a deal with Hitler to produce synthetic gasoline. Hitler wanted it because he wanted Germany to be energy independent. He wanted energy independence for Germany. And Bosch wanted it because he wanted money to finish his plant and keep his plant going. Bosch was an anti-Hitlerite. He hated Hitler. He thought that Hitler was irrational and prejudiced and a danger to Germany, but he was in power. He controlled the government. And so Bosch made a deal with the devil. Essentially, he got the funding he needed from the German government. He ramped up this huge artificial synthetic oil facility, synthetic gasoline facility called Luna. Luna was a plant, one of the biggest factories in the world. It was 3 miles long and a mile wide. It employed 35,000 people, and basically what it did was it took in coal and made gasoline out of it. It was very important to the Nazis and what they had to do. But Bosch still hated Hitler. They were trying to get along, and then Bosch had a meeting with Hitler. This was just before the United States got into World War II. And he decided that he would sit down with Hitler and explain to him the value of being a liberal as far as science was concerned. In Germany, Hitler had been talking about dismissing every Jew who was working for the government in Germany. He wanted all Jews out of government. And that included a lot of government researchers or university professors who worked for the government who would have lost their jobs, a number of Jewish researchers, chemists and physicists who would have lost their jobs. And Bosch decided that it was his duty to go and oppose this edict, and he would have a nice rational sit-down with Adolf Hitler. By the way, when the edict went into place, Hitler did make that edict a law of Germany, and he dismissed all Jews from civil service, and Fritz Haber was one of them. The fellow who discovered this method was working in a government-sponsored think tank, a research facility. He was the head of his own institute, and he resigned his post in protest because as a Jew, he couldn't stand the idea that his own country, the Germany that he had done everything for his whole life, would betray the Jewish people this way. He resigned. Within weeks of Haber's resignation, Bosch made the mistake of meeting with Hitler privately. Hitler was forming a high-level economics council to provide advice to his government and had asked Bosch to serve. Some of the prospective members, including Bosch, were asked to private interviews in Berlin. Bosch had been carefully tracking the Nazis' economic policies and noting Hitler's increasingly radical pronouncements. He had been stunned by the purge of Jews from the civil service. The Chancellor seemed capable of veering suddenly from sensible to dangerous. Hitler, for his part, had his secret police gather information on Bosch and his political views. They found that Bosch was a typical Southwest German liberal, a highly educated friend of the Jews, but a man who seemed to put business and science above ideology. Bosch tended to complain about the Nazis. He had felt compelled to make his own views known about the civil service law to members of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, for instance, and appeared to want to keep his own Jewish scientists in place at Farben. He was protecting his Jewish scientists. The secret police knew that he had no intention of joining the Nazi Party. They knew that he had in 1929 bailed out a foundering liberal newspaper. They knew that he was friends with Hermann Bucher, head of a large German electrical firm, and a man so vehemently anti-Nazi that friends had to warn him to keep quiet in public. The newly formed Gestapo was in the process of gathering large dossiers on both Bucher and Bosch. Luckily, someone soon warned them about the secret files, and they somehow managed to have them both stolen from the Gestapo offices, and they were said to have burned the files in their fireplace. Bosch's meeting with Hitler started well enough. Bosch talked about synthetic gasoline and the need to expand Luna, his giant synthetic gas facility. Hitler seemed agreeable. Then Bosch felt compelled to start talking about the civil service law and the damage that would be done to German chemistry and physics if it were applied unsparingly to Jewish scientists. Hitler lost his temper and shouted, "You don't understand these matters," and started ranting about the Jewish threat. If Jews were so important to physics and chemistry, Hitler said, then we'll just have to work 100 years without physics and chemistry. When Bosch tried to disagree, Hitler, in a calculated insult, rang for an aide and announced that his visitor wished to leave. That was the only time the two of them met. Within a few years, Bosch had been driven from power in his company, and again, this was the most powerful chemical company on earth, all built on this technology, synthetic nitrogen from the air, synthetic fuels from the air. IG Farben was the third largest business of any sort on earth at the time. Third to, I think, General Motors and U.S. Steel employed more people. Farben was number 3 in the world. It was huge. Bosch had built the company. He was forced out of it. He was put in honorary positions on the sideline. He started drinking. Within a few years, before the end of the war, he was dead. Haber, the co-discoverer, driven from his post, resigned from his post, deciding late in life that he would rather be Jewish than German, died of a broken heart, literally, a broken heart, his heart gave out, within a year or two of losing his post. Both men have really, well, especially Bosch. Bosch has never received the proper treatment. I think my book stands as the most extensive treatment of his life in the English language. He was an industrialist who ranked with Rockefeller. He was sort of like Rockefeller and Bill Gates rolled into one. He was an inventor and an industrialist, and he built this gigantic company, and we don't know anything about him. It was a very, very tragic life that he led. So that was the invention that's feeding us all now. Every time you take a bite of food, you can thank Haber and Bosch. Giant factories using Haber-Bosch technology exist now around the world. Their technology is being used in every major country. Haber-Bosch factories, these air into fertilizer factories, consume 1% of all the energy that's burned in the United States every year. What they've done in total around the world is made possible life as we know it. Without those factories, more than 2 billion people would starve to death today. half the nitrogen in your body came out of one of these factories. That's what's putting the fertilizer on the field, that's growing the grain and feeding the animals that feed us. That's the reason instead of mass starvation now, we are suffering from an epidemic of obesity around the world. Haber-Bosch had an enormous impact. And I want to end with a sobering thought, though. Every scientific discovery has its plus side and its minus side. It's what I call a two-edged sword. And people often think that science is either one thing or another. It's either all good, and working for the good of mankind and doing altruistic research that will benefit everyone, or it's all bad. And they're inventing things that are going to make our world toxic and are going to kill us all. Well, in fact, in my view, science is neither all good nor all bad. But in fact, every aspect of science is double-faced, Janus-faced. There's a good side and a bad side to all of it. It's sort of like these enormously powerful tools that are given to us, and we decide what to do with them. So Haber-Bosch built fortunes and underlies our population growth today, and is stitched into all of our lives. That nitrogen is literally stitched into your DNA now. That came out of a Haber-Bosch factory. It's in every protein in your body. So we're all living off of this discovery. Nobody knows about it, and nobody knows too very much about the environmental damage that the discovery is causing. So, a lot of people today are interested, I think, in questions of overpopulation still, and what it means for our planet. This discovery, in addition to its many benefits, also has a downside. And the major downside that I'm going to talk about for just a minute is this. If a farmer puts a ton of artificial fertilizer on a field, and they do that every year, they put a ton of artificial fertilizer on a field, half of that ends up going in the water or back up in the air. Okay? So we're producing this ocean of fixed nitrogen now. We've actually doubled the amount of fixed nitrogen that's in the biosphere on Earth. It's a little experiment that we're running on the Earth right now. It's like we've got a giant hypodermic filled with fertilizer, and we're just shooting it into the Earth. And we've doubled the amount of fixed nitrogen on Earth within the last, say, 70 years. That's an experiment on a global scale that I think makes global warming and carbon dioxide look sort of marginal, because the nitrogen cycle is essential to life, and we're just supercharging it. We're just hyping it up. We're finding out just now what that means, what our little experiment means. One thing, of course, it means that we have 6.7 billion people and we're all getting fat. That's one thing that it means. The other thing that it means is that nitrogen that's not going into the plants on the farmer's field, but is instead going mostly into the water, ends up getting into the rivers, and the rivers carry it down to the ocean. And suddenly you have this super injection of fertilizer into the ocean. So very briefly, I'll read just a short thing about what that means for us, something to think about. Avoiding famine is the good news. The not so good news is that the flood of synthetic nitrogen from Haber-Bosch plants is ending up in more places than food, like in our air and water. As a Stanford ecologist put it, we can't make food without mobilizing a lot of nitrogen, and we can't mobilize a lot of nitrogen without spreading some around. Before Haber-Bosch, there were only two ways to get nitrogen out of the air and into food. One was lightning, but the most important one was that slow, steady process by which a few types of bacteria ate the atmospheric nitrogen and broke it apart and reformed it into substances plants could eat. That's bacterial nitrogen fixation. Some of these bacteria set up homes in nodules attached to the roots of plants, notably legumes like peas and beans, and this is where we get the crop rotation that we talked about before. So we've supercharged the process. Researchers estimate, for example, that about half of all Haber-Bosch fixed nitrogen ends up in our air and water, not in our food. Nitrogen leaches into the ground and ends up in streams and lakes. It's mobile and can be formed into many kinds of molecules in many different ways. But much of it enters water systems in the form of what are called nitrates, and you may have heard about nitrate pollution. The level of nitrates, and again, this is fixed nitrogen from these plants primarily. The level of nitrates in the Mississippi today is 4 times what it was in 1900. Levels in the Rhine River in Europe are double those in the Mississippi. It does not all come from farmers. There is manure runoff from ranches. The manure, of course, is rich in nitrogen from animals who were grown on feed made by crops fed with Haber-Bosch fertilizer, so the same nitrogen gets in there. And there's municipal water, and there's excess lawn fertilizer and home sewage. And while nitrogen in water is not highly toxic in the sense of poisoning people, it can rise to dangerous levels. It's been linked to health problems like methemoglobinemia or blue baby syndrome. The precise role of high nitrate levels in disease, however, is still uncertain. What is known is that nitrogen in the water ends up feeding blooms of algae and weeds that turn waterways green and cloudy. It can get so bad that it cuts off the sun reaching the depths, killing the life below. As the vegetation dies and rots, it pulls oxygen out of the water. As the oxygen levels go down, bottom-dwelling fish, animals, shellfish, and mollusks begin to die off. The animals that feed on them starve. Toxins begin to collect and freshwater systems begin to die. This is freshwater. Then it hits the ocean. Somewhere around 1.5 million tons of fixed nitrogen flows into the Baltic Sea north of Germany every year, making it one of the most polluted marine systems on Earth. Oxygen levels are so low in some areas of the Baltic that the bottom is blanketed with mats of oxygen-hating bacteria. The Baltic cod industry collapsed in the 1990s. The same thing is beginning to happen worldwide. The Great Barrier Reef in Australia is starting to show the effects of vastly increased fertilizer use, and so is the Mediterranean, and so is the Black Sea. But the biggest and best known of all the nitrate-affected waters in the world is the dead zone off the coast of Louisiana in the United States, where the Mississippi and Atchafalaya rivers flow into the Gulf of Mexico. Those two river systems drain more than 40% of the United States, continental United States, including some of the most intensively fertilized farmland in 31 states. Nitrate levels in the Gulf have more than doubled in the past 40 years. At the same time, life in the water has increasingly begun to suffocate. The dead zone is a region where aquatic plants bloom, clams and lobsters die, fish flee, and the entire ecology has changed. The zone in the Gulf fluctuates in size with the seasons, but it's now on average roughly the size of the state of New Jersey. Every year it gets a little bigger. More than 150 smaller dead zones have been identified around the world, from Chesapeake Bay to the coast of Japan. Nitrogen pollution is not only the only cause. Water currents, temperatures, and natural fluxes in the growth of plants and animals also play a part in dead zones. But the role Haber-Bosch plays is critical. Here again, much remains to be learned. We're just beginning to grasp what this is all about now. Nitrogen and this turbocharging of the nitrogen in our world also puts a lot of nitrogen into the air. And right now, if you go up in the Arctic and it rains, it's raining fertilizer. There's a small amount of fertilizer in the rain everywhere in the world. In fact, in some areas of the world, when it rains, it applies about as much fertilizer as American farmers put on their spring wheat every year. It's incredible what we've done, and yet scientists are just beginning to track it. What does that mean? When you're growing more plants, you think, well, gee, you're fertilizing the Arctic, say, and you've got an Arctic forest, and suddenly, hey, it's got this influx of fertilizer. What could be bad about that? You just grow more Arctic forest. Well, what happens is that there is a burst of growth because it's fertilizer, and now you lift the nitrogen cap, and then suddenly it grows. But what happens is it throws off the balance up there. That's a nitrogen poor environment. It doesn't have a lot of nitrogen up there. So you start delivering this atmospheric fertilizer, and suddenly the species that really like nitrogen grow a whole bunch. And the ones that are adapted to low nitrogen can't compete, and the ecology shifts. And some of the fertilizer ends up in the water, and it acidifies the water, and it changes the pH, and that shifts the ecology. So again, it's an experiment. We'll see what happens with that. But that's the way that inventions like this can affect us, not only directly in how we live our daily lives, but also in very significant ways that we don't yet understand. I hope we can grapple with that in coming years. I'm here to sign books if you'd like, but I thank you for coming out. I'm happy to take questions if anyone has any questions. Any questions at all? I've answered everything. Yes?
You talked about the amount of residual nitrogen that is lost. Is there a way to increase the amount of nitrogen that's used so you don't have as much?
On a farmer's field, you're talking about? Yeah, I was in the Museum of Natural History here today. They have a special exhibit on soil. One of the panels in the exhibit is about wise use of fertilizer by farmers, and you see that a lot. One thing is, there's a little food crisis right now not because there isn't enough food, but because the cost of food's gone up. Cost of food goes up because it takes energy to produce fertilizer. In great degree, fertilizer costs go up, the cost of crops goes up. And when energy goes up, fertilizer costs go up. So what farmers are doing in response is trying to figure out how to use less fertilizer. Smart. And it's good for the environment, too. And it is true, the good old days, 20 years ago, you just buy it by the ton and spread it every year because you get really good crops that way. And what they're figuring out now is that you can still get good crops and you can use a lot less. So yeah, there's some research going on that way. Absolutely. Any other questions at all? Well, thank you very much. Oh, yes.
You say necessity is the mother of invention, so all these people were working on a method to get nitrogen. Were there any other people who were close or on the right track, or was this person the only one who was on the right track? And has the method changed over time significantly?
Yeah. The question was, were other methods found that were also successful? I mentioned Birkeland and his disc of flame, and that was a method that worked. The disc of flame actually did make fertilizer, but it was cost ineffective. The nice thing about Haber-Bosch, and the reason it's lasted so long, and in basically the same form, using the same ideas, same principles, it's been improved. It's more efficient now than it was, but the same approach, the same concept, high pressure, high temperature, and a catalyst, is the basis of the industry today. The Birkeland experiment was a great one, but it turned out to be more expensive because you're eating up so much electricity. Haber-Bosch, the brilliance of Haber-Bosch is once you get these things up and running, they almost run themselves. They don't use much energy. The reason that they burn so much of the energy in the United States every year, 1% of all the energy goes into these plants. The reason is because the raw material for making ammonia, which is the primary product, you get the nitrogen from the air, but the hydrogen is not in the air, and you get the hydrogen from natural gas. So they pump enormous amounts of natural gas into these machines in order to provide the hydrogen to make the ammonia, and that's where the energy loss comes from. There's some pollution questions there too, but it's low cost compared to other methods. Yeah.
Germany being close to with the synthetic gasoline, what would it take in today's world, with energy being where it is, for the coal reserves we have in West Virginia and this process to tip the balance back towards synthetic gasoline?
Yeah. The question is about whether synthetic gasoline in the way that they were doing it is still a possibility today, and it sure is. The technology is there. The United States was very interested in that technology, especially right after World War II. Every time there's an energy crisis, people get interested in that technology. In my view, what you're doing is you're taking one fossil fuel, which is coal, and you're making another fossil fuel, which is gasoline. And you're using a lot of fossil fuels to make that happen because it requires high heat and pressure and so on. And then you've got to transport the coal to the plant, and it's a dirty industry. They're trying to figure out ways to make it clean. They're trying to figure out ways to sequester the carbon dioxide and so on. And we do have a lot of coal. What I'll tell you is that 70 years ago, well, at the height of World War II, here's a fact for you. The height of World War II, 1944, 3/4 of Germany's gasoline was synthetic. They made it themselves out of coal. They had a lot of coal in Germany. They made their own gasoline. 3/4 of the country's energy needs, which were very high at the time because they were fighting World War II, was from synthetic gas. They made that happen. They created a synthetic gas production capacity at that level, ran 3/4 of their country on it. They created that capacity within about 5 years. They made that happen. So when you want to talk about pollution is one thing, and coal mining and coal conversion into gas is not a pretty way to make gasoline. But if you're interested in energy independence, yes, there is the capability to get independent of foreign oil. We could do it. You bet. Germans did it, and they did it 70 years ago, and the technology is better now. Any last thoughts? Any last questions? Well, it's been a pleasure reading before you tonight. Thank you very much for coming out.
Thomas Hager is author of The Demon Under the Microscope and The Force of Nature. His writings on medicine and science have appeared in numerous publications, including Journal of the American Medical Association and Reader's Digest. For more information on Thomas Hager, visit his website at thomashager.net. For more information